In 1990, a devoted young nurse vanishes without a trace after leaving her night shift at a regional hospital. 11 years later, her long-dead pager suddenly buzzes to life in an abandoned wing, triggering a haunting investigation that unearths buried secrets, a hidden medical conspiracy, and the chilling truth behind her disappearance. The rain hadn't let up for hours that night. It tapped against the high windows of St. Amelia Regional Hospital like impatient fingers as the graveyard shift crawled into its final hour. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The halls smelled faintly of bleach and wet wool. Nurse Lena Harrow, 28 years old and known for her calm under pressure, was wrapping up her shift. She'd helped admit a young burn victim, sat with an elderly man through his final breath, and filled out a stack of intake reports no one else wanted to touch. She was tired, but it was the good kind of tired, the kind that meant she'd done right by people. At 4:06 a.m., Lena nodded to the receptionist at the front desk, slipped her stethoscope into her tote, and headed toward the employee locker room. Surveillance footage would later show her pushing open the staff exit doors, umbrella tucked under one arm, badge clipped neatly to her scrubs, and then nothing. No footage after that. No record of her badge being used to open any exterior door. Her car sat untouched in the lot, driver's seat dry and locked, keys still in her locker. No one remembered seeing her after she passed through those double doors, and the parking lot security camera, along with all the others on that side of the building, had inexplicably lost power for exactly 97 minutes, between 3:43 and 5:20 a.m. By sunrise, the ER buzz had faded into quiet dread. The nurses took turns calling her apartment, her mother, her ex-boyfriend. One of the orderlies claimed he saw her walking near the west wing, but that wing had been sealed since the fire in '82 and was off-limits to staff. The janitor who cleaned the lobby swore he heard a buzzing sound coming from one of the supply closets around 4:30, but brushed it off. The buzz was constant in hospitals. Lena Harrow was declared missing by noon. Posters went up by dinner. Her case would gather dust on cold case shelves, whispered about only in break rooms or on stormy nights like that one. And for 11 years, her pager, serial number stamped with her initials, remained silent, its signal presumed dead. Until it buzzed again. It had been a slow night for the janitor on call. Just past 3:00 a.m., the halls were mostly empty, the few nurses still on duty leaning over paperwork or stealing quiet moments with vending machine coffee. Carl Benson, 62 and near retirement, was sweeping near the old West Wing stairwell when he thought he saw something, a faint flicker of movement past the fire door's wire-reinforced glass. He paused, peering in, but the hallway beyond was dark. He shook his head and kept moving. That wing had been shut down for almost a decade, sealed off after an electrical fire took out half its power grid. The hospital never rebuilt it. It just stayed locked, forgotten. At 4:11 a.m., the emergency room's charge nurse, Janet Coe, glanced at the time and made a mental note that Lena hadn't clocked out. Maybe she was finishing up notes. Maybe she ran into a patient family, but 5 minutes later she still hadn't come back to retrieve her bag from the nurse's station. By 4:25, Janet was worried enough to check the locker room herself. Lena's uniform jacket was still hanging inside, car keys untouched in the small wooden cubby. Her hospital ID badge was missing. Security was notified at 5:05 a.m. The response was slow, understaffed, like everything else. One guard walked the halls, another checked the parking lot. Lena's car, a beat-up '87 Civic, sat beneath the single functioning light in the west lot, completely dry. She hadn't even unlocked it. Her brother was called at 6:42. By sunrise, her mother had driven in from Springfield and was pacing the ER lobby in house slippers, clutching a crumpled photo of Lena from nursing school. The strangest thing at the time was the silence. Not just from the investigation, which stalled almost immediately, but from Lena herself. She'd carried a hospital-issued pager, standard issue for all ER nurses on night shift. It was synced to the hospital's internal system and had a tracking log, but her last message showed a blank, unreadable timestamp, and the pager itself was gone. Not in her locker, not on the floor, not in Lost and Found. It would be more than a decade before anyone saw it again. And by then, it would be buried beneath dust, sealed behind a door no one remembered unlocking. By the time the sun came up over St. Amelia Regional, the building had settled into a strange, uneasy quiet. The usual shift change chatter was subdued, the nurses glancing at one another across the break room with furrowed brows and whispered fragments of what-ifs. Lena Harrow wasn't someone who simply forgot to check out or wandered off without explanation. She was meticulous, responsible, the one who stayed late to double-check med charts and covered call-ins without complaint. For her to vanish, leaving her car, her keys, her coat, it didn't make sense. Detectives arrived mid-morning, took statements, walked the length of the ER and staff corridors. A checklist was drawn up, then rechecked twice. There were no signs of forced entry. No one reported screams, scuffles, or emergency calls. Her last confirmed sighting was caught by a nurse heading out. Lena had waved goodnight in the corridor near radiology, already halfway to the back exit. After that, she was smoke. Security footage offered nothing. The internal VCR-style system that monitored the back hallways had suffered a total blackout, one that coincided almost exactly with the time Lena disappeared. Technicians blamed an outdated power supply, though they couldn't explain why none of the other hospital systems had recorded a surge or interruption. The West Wing cameras, long since powered down and rarely maintained, had nothing to offer either. One of the guards mentioned seeing flickering lights behind the old surgical suite windows once or twice that night, but shrugged it off. Everyone knew that Wing was dead space. Power didn't even run there anymore. Lena's belongings were collected and inventoried. Her locker remained untouched, a few pens, folded scrubs, a miniature flashlight, her personal keys. The one item never recovered, not from her shift bag or station desk, was her pager. It had been clipped to her waistband that night, standard policy for ER staff on call. No one recalled seeing it after she vanished. Records showed no further pings or alerts from her number. It was presumed lost. But what no one knew, what no one could have imagined, was that the pager had never really stopped working. Its battery hadn't died. Its signal hadn't failed. It was waiting. Waiting in the dark, just a few walls away, behind a door welded shut and forgotten. For the first few days, the investigation stayed active. Detectives made calls, knocked on doors, even brought in a bloodhound team to sweep the surrounding woods and access tunnels near the West Wing. Volunteers handed out flyers across town. Local news ran segments with Lena's graduation photo, her nurse's cap slightly tilted, her smile soft but sure. But by the end of the week, the urgency began to fade. There were no witnesses, no signs of a struggle, and no clear motive. Lena had no known enemies, no history of mental illness, and no reason to run. She had plans, an upcoming niece's birthday party, a scheduled weekend shift, a phone bill that had already auto-paid 2 days after she vanished. It didn't feel like someone who wanted to disappear. The hospital, under pressure from both staff and the public, quietly increased security for a time. Locks were checked, lights were upgraded, and staff were told to stay in groups when leaving after dark. But unofficially, the administration wanted the whole thing to go away. Lawsuits loomed when a staff member went missing on the property, and whispers of liability spread fast. Within 3 weeks, Lena's name was no longer spoken aloud by the higher-ups. Her locker was emptied and boxed, her position quietly posted. The nurses, however, didn't forget. They kept her photo pinned to the break room board. Some left her favorite brand of tea in the cabinet. A few lit candles in the chapel after each shift. The silence surrounding her disappearance never sat right with them. And it wasn't just the absence, it was the way everything surrounding that night felt oddly scrubbed. Equipment logs had missing entries. Phone records from her last hour were marked with a system error, and that old West Wing, the one sealed since the fire in 1982, had suddenly been placed under renewed maintenance lockdown. One nurse, a soft-spoken second shifter named Corrine, had seen Lena heading in that direction the night she vanished. She'd hesitated to mention it. The West Wing was supposed to be empty, and she'd assumed Lena was just passing by. But the memory lingered, sharp as glass. Later, she'd tell a friend that something about the way Lena glanced over her shoulder that night didn't seem casual. It looked like she was listening for something. Or someone. It was a Tuesday morning when Lena's mother, Evelyn Harrow, stepped through the automatic doors of St. Amelia for the first time since her daughter vanished. The staff tried to keep their distance. No one knew what to say. Evelyn, usually polished and poised, wore a plain coat and carried a folder stuffed with papers and phone records. She'd come for answers, but received only vague apologies and carefully worded explanations. The head of hospital administration met her in a windowless conference room and repeated the phrase, "ongoing investigation," until her voice sounded like a dial tone. Evelyn asked about Lena's last known steps, the camera footage, the parking lot. She asked about the West Wing. The administrator stiffened slightly, said that area was condemned and inaccessible. Evelyn pressed harder. Had anyone searched it? Had the police gone inside? The answer came too quickly. Yes, of course, but nothing was found. When Evelyn asked for the report, she was told it wasn't available for public release. Later that afternoon, she wandered through the main corridor, brushing her fingertips along the walls like she could feel her daughter's presence in the grain of the paint. She stopped by the nurse's station, looking down at the cluttered desk where Lena had spent so many hours charting vitals and organizing meds. Someone had placed a potted plant in the corner, wilting from neglect. A nurse named Deb quietly handed Evelyn a sealed plastic bag containing Lena's stethoscope and her half-used shift notebook. It was all they had returned. When Evelyn left the hospital that day, she didn't speak to reporters or take calls. Instead, she sat in her car for nearly 20 minutes, staring at the emergency bay entrance. In her lap was the hospital's staff directory, dog-eared and marked with red ink. She circled 3 names. 2 were doctors who'd worked that night. The third was a name she didn't recognize, Craig Vinton, an orderly assigned to a department that hadn't existed since 1985. Over the following months, Evelyn made calls, wrote letters, and kept every scrap of information she could find. Her notes became a kind of prayer, each page a plea to someone who might still be listening. But no matter how many doors she knocked on, one stayed closed: the West Wing, the one place no one wanted to talk about. The West Wing had its own kind of silence. It wasn't the same as the late-night stillness that fell over the active floors of St. Amelia. This was heavier, like the air itself remembered things. After the fire in 1982, which damaged a large portion of the surgical ward and several patient rooms, the hospital had sealed it off, citing budget constraints and structural concerns. But to those who worked nearby, especially the older staff, it never quite faded from memory. Nurses spoke of cold spots and strange echoes when passing the east stairwell. Some swore they could hear distant shuffling from inside, like footsteps walking through empty halls. Maintenance crews avoided it unless absolutely necessary, and even then, they went in pairs. Craig Vinton, the orderly whose name Evelyn had circled, was rarely seen after Lena's disappearance. On paper, he was listed as having resigned 3 days later. No forwarding address, no exit interview. Just gone. A few staff members remembered him vaguely. Quiet, polite, kept mostly to himself. He had been reassigned to the ER from the West Wing during its final weeks of operation in the early 80s, before the fire shut everything down. He never talked about it. When Evelyn asked about him during her visits to the hospital, she was met with shrugs and hesitations. One nurse, who'd been there for nearly 2 decades, finally admitted something odd. She remembered seeing Craig near the old supply corridor the night Lena disappeared, holding a clipboard and looking lost. She hadn't thought much of it at the time, but now she regretted not saying more. The police had tried to track Craig down during the initial investigation, but their efforts stalled. His personnel file was incomplete, missing an address and emergency contact. The phone number on record had been disconnected by the time investigators tried calling. It was as if he had vanished just as easily as Lena. There was a brief moment, in the spring of 1991, when a night nurse reported seeing someone in scrubs through the small wired window of a locked door leading into the West Wing. Security checked it. Nothing. No sign of forced entry, no tools, no broken lock. They told her she must have imagined it, but she knew what she saw. And she remembered the unmistakable shape of a pager clipped to the figure's waistband, glowing faintly in the dark. It was hard to say when the rumors really started. Maybe it was a nurse who said too much during a smoke break, or a new intern catching whispers in the break room after midnight. But by the summer of 1990, long before Lena vanished, the West Wing had become a fixture in hospital lore. Staff said the lights flickered on their own, even though power was supposedly shut off. Cold air leaked from under the doors. Janitors reported supplies missing from locked closets. A few claimed to hear voices, low, muffled, like someone talking just behind the walls. Most chalked it up to stories meant to scare the rookies. Every hospital had them. But then, someone found a surgical glove, crisp white, powder-dusted, and freshly worn, sitting in the middle of the sealed West Wing stairwell. No one admitted placing it there, and the only door to the stairwell had been padlocked from the inside. Security took it, shrugged, and tossed it in with lost and found. No report filed. It didn't help that no one knew exactly what had happened during the fire 8 years earlier. The official cause was listed as an electrical short, but longtime staff remembered the event as something else. A patient had died that night, one transferred quietly from another facility without a name attached. Records were sealed, and for weeks afterward, certain administrators came and went with grim expressions and closed folders. After the fire, instead of repairing the wing, the hospital shut it off entirely. Hallways were walled over, stairwells chained. And just like that, an entire portion of the hospital vanished from daily life. Still, some nights, orderlies on the late shift would swear they saw movement beyond the old windows, a flicker of light, a figure pausing near the third-floor corridor. One nurse said she heard the faint sound of a heart monitor beeping, sharp and steady, from the abandoned ICU. Another, while doing rounds near the east side, said a door rattled behind her just once. When she turned, no one was there. She never reported it. No one wanted to be the nurse who blamed ghosts. But later, when Lena went missing and her pager failed to turn up, some of those stories came rushing back. The wing, no one entered. The one Lena had been seen walking toward just minutes before she vanished. Lena's younger brother, Michael Harrow, was 17 when she disappeared. At the time, he was a high school senior, quiet and academically focused, already accepted into a journalism program on a partial scholarship. Her vanishing gutted what was left of their family. Their father had died years earlier in a factory accident, and their mother, Evelyn, never fully recovered from Lena's absence. She kept the porch light on for months, then years, until the bulb socket rusted. By the time Michael entered college, he was carrying a tangle of guilt and helplessness he didn't know how to name. He hadn't called her that week. He hadn't replied to her last letter. But he kept it, folded and tucked in a shoebox, the final note she'd written him 2 days before she vanished, reminding him to eat during exams and promising to visit campus soon. For a while, Michael poured himself into school and journalism. He wrote hard-edged editorials for his college paper, covered missing persons cases when no one else would. He studied FOIA laws, court procedures, public records access. Beneath it all was Lena, always Lena, whose name never left the quiet space between every deadline and byline. Years passed. Their mother died in 1996 after a brief illness. Her final request, scribbled in a shaky hand, was for Michael to keep looking, and so he did. Whenever he had time between jobs or assignments, he pulled up old hospital records, requested missing police reports, cross-referenced staff lists. The trail always led him back to St. Amelia. He found inconsistencies, missing log entries, pages torn from timesheets. When he asked for security footage or badge access logs from the night of October 17, he was told the records no longer existed. Power failure, archive error, misfiled documentation, the excuses stacked like bricks. In 1999, he wrote a long-form piece for a small regional magazine titled "The Nurse Who Walked into the Dark." It garnered modest attention, but no real leads. Still, the article caught the eye of someone who worked in the hospital's maintenance division, an older man who'd spent decades cleaning its corners and forgotten spaces. He sent Michael an unmarked envelope with a note that read, "You're not wrong. And that wing? They never really sealed it the way they said." The letter included a faded blueprint, one Michael would study every night before sleep, memorizing its cracks. By late 2000, the case of Lena Harrow had faded from public memory. Her name no longer appeared in the local paper, and younger hospital staff barely recognized her photo when it turned up in a dusty manila folder during orientation. The hospital had grown since the early 90s, adding a new East Wing, renovating patient rooms, and investing in digital systems to replace the old paper records. The administration had changed hands twice. Files were boxed, shifted, and in some cases, quietly destroyed. But beneath the polished linoleum and upgraded lighting, the bones of the old building remained. The West Wing was still sealed, though not as tightly as the hospital claimed. Time and weather had worked their way through the structure. Hinges rusted, pipes groaned. A few of the interior doors, long thought welded shut, had loosened with the slow persistence of gravity and neglect. That fall, a crew of contractors was brought in to assess structural integrity ahead of a proposed renovation. Most assumed the wing would be gutted or demolished entirely. What they didn't expect was to find signs of recent movement. It started with a faint odor, not quite rot, not quite mold, something older, sour and metallic, drifting through the cracked ventilation. Then came the dust patterns. In one of the back corridors, a thick coating of dust had been clearly disturbed, not by rats or water, but by footprints, small, consistent, left to right, then vanishing into the dark. One of the contractors, a part-time night janitor named Alvis Green, didn't report what he saw immediately. He waited a week, thinking maybe he'd imagined it. But something kept tugging at him. So, he returned late one night with a flashlight and his teenage son, who he kept close by as they crept down the locked hall. At the end of the corridor, they found the old nurse's station. Most of it was intact, counters, rusted supply carts, even the faded whiteboard still clinging to the wall with ghost-like scrawl barely visible. And sitting there on the linoleum floor, coated in grime, was a hospital-issue pager. The screen was dark, the casing chipped. But when Alvis picked it up, the screen flickered once and gave off a single, unmistakable buzz. At first, Alvis didn't believe what he was holding. It was heavy with dirt, buttons worn smooth, the once clear screen now clouded with time and grime. He turned it over in his hands, half expecting it to fall apart, but it didn't. Instead, it let out a soft electric chirp that echoed unnaturally in the stale air around them. His son jumped. Alvis stood frozen. The screen flickered again, this time revealing a half-lit timestamp. It read 4:12 a.m. The date, unmistakably, was October 18, 1990. They left immediately. Back through the narrow hall, down the side stairs, and out through a service door that had long since lost its alarm system. Neither of them spoke on the ride home. Alvis placed the pager in a small cloth bag and stored it in a fireproof lockbox he kept beneath his bed, unsure of what to do next. But the image of that flickering timestamp wouldn't leave him. He remembered the name Lena Harrow, not because he knew her, but because the hospital used to talk about her like a ghost story, the nurse who walked off shift and vanished. Everyone had heard it at some point, though the details were always foggy. By the end of the week, Alvis called in sick and drove to a public library 2 towns over. He pulled microfilm archives and flipped through old news articles. It didn't take long. Lena's photo, sunlit and hopeful, stared back at him from the front page of a 1990 local paper. Her name matched the faint etching on the back of the pager, LH 904. It was hers. Alvis debated going to the police, but something made him hesitate. The way the hospital had handled her disappearance had always seemed quiet. Too quiet. Reports filed late. Footage missing. A wing locked and forgotten without ever being properly investigated, so instead he wrote a letter. Not to law enforcement, not to the press, but to the name listed at the bottom of one of those old articles, Michael Harrow. He included a photocopy of the pager, the timestamp, and a single line scribbled at the bottom. "You were right not to stop looking. Call me." Then he mailed it without a return address, hoping the right person would still be watching. Michael read the letter 3 times before he believed it was real. The envelope had no return address, just a dated postmark and his name printed in careful block letters. The photocopy inside was grainy but unmistakable. A hospital-issued pager, cracked and worn, its screen caught mid-buzz, with the numbers barely legible. He traced the timestamp with his thumb, 4:12 a.m. on the morning Lena disappeared. He didn't know what shook him more, the suddenness of it resurfacing or the fact that someone had gone to such lengths to place it in his hands after all this time. He dug out his old notes, every page, every scribbled theory and timeline pinned across his kitchen table. 11 years had done nothing to dim the sharp ache of not knowing. He still remembered the police telling him they'd done all they could. He remembered being 20, sitting across from his mother's hospice bed and promising her he'd never stop searching. And now, this pager, this impossible, buzzing shard of the past, had returned to him with no explanation, just a silent demand for attention. Michael called the number written at the bottom of the letter. It rang 6 times before a voice answered, low and unsure. Alvis hesitated before telling him who he was, and even then, only in pieces. He mentioned the West Wing, the dust patterns, the footprints no one had made. He said he wasn't supposed to be in there, that it had felt wrong the moment he stepped into that hallway. Michael listened in silence. When Alvis finished, he offered only one word, where. They met in the parking lot of a shuttered diner off Route 38. Alvis brought the pager, still wrapped in the cloth bag. He handed it over with shaking hands, like it might buzz again just from being touched. Michael thanked him, but his eyes stayed fixed on the device. It was heavier than he expected, not just in weight, but in memory, the last thing Lena ever carried. 11 years later, it still had power, still wanted to be heard. That night, Michael didn't sleep. He stayed at the kitchen table, staring at the pager until dawn, wondering if it had more to say. Wondering how something that should have died in the dark was still calling out to him, as if it had waited all this time for someone to finally listen. Michael didn't go straight to the police. Something about the pager's sudden reappearance, the quiet way it had been handed off, the unease in Alvis's voice, it all felt like a warning cloaked in a gift. He spent the next 2 days combing through everything he had, rereading Lena's personnel files, the investigation summaries, his old interview notes. He cross-referenced every timestamp from that morning in 1990, lining them up beside the one frozen on the pager screen. It didn't take long for a pattern to emerge. At exactly 4:12 a.m., the hospital's internal systems logged a power fluctuation across 3 floors, including the ER, radiology, and most notably, the West Wing. The official explanation at the time had been a failing transformer that triggered an automatic bypass. But there had been no repair request, no replacement documented, and the surge was never reported to the local power company. It wasn't just a glitch, it had been buried. He remembered something Lena had once said in passing during a phone call weeks before she disappeared. She had joked about the hospital having too many secrets. Said the power grid was older than the walls and that parts of the building ran on systems no one fully understood. She had been laughing, but there was an edge to it, something unsettled. The pager sat beside him now, silent but intact. He had taken it apart carefully, examining the battery and wiring. Nothing about it explained how it still held a charge after more than a decade. When he tried to test the components, the device buzzed again, just once, before the screen went dark. This time, no numbers showed. Just a line of static across the display, like interference bleeding in from somewhere it didn't belong. He started making calls. A former tech who'd installed the hospital's original paging system, a nurse who'd retired in 1992 and still remembered which codes were used for what. A friend from college who worked in analog electronics and owed him a favor. Piece by piece, the picture sharpened. Whatever had happened to Lena that night hadn't been random, and whatever that pager was connected to, it hadn't gone silent because no one was listening. It had gone silent because someone wanted it that way. Until now. St. Amelia Regional was preparing for another transformation. After years of stalled budget talks and deferred maintenance, the board finally approved a long-delayed renovation project. The West Wing, long considered a liability, was slated for full evaluation and possible demolition. Most of the current staff had never even stepped foot near that part of the hospital. The name Lena Harrow, if it came up at all, was usually passed around like an old myth, one of those half-true stories interns told each other to stay awake during long shifts. The cleanup crew arrived in early spring. They came with respirators and clipboards, work lights and generators. The wing's outer doors, which had been padlocked and bolted shut for nearly 2 decades, creaked open under the strain of rusted hinges and water damage. The air inside was thick and sour, filled with dust, insulation, and a strange oily smell that clung to the walls. The old nurse's station was still there, warped from heat and moisture, its drawers swollen shut. Cabinets hung crooked on their hinges. A wheelchair sat abandoned in the corner, its wheels flattened and cracked. Among the workers was a younger man named Leo, brought on for temporary labor. On his second day, while clearing debris near the east corridor, he stepped into a partially collapsed room that had once been a small supply closet. Inside, he found a warped metal locker tipped over against the wall, half buried in ceiling tile and plaster. As he shifted the debris, he saw something catch the light, a faded cloth pouch tucked just out of view. Curious, he opened it. Inside were 2 items, a nurse's ID badge and a cracked hospital-issued radio clipped to an old lanyard. The badge bore a name he didn't recognize at first, Lena Harrow. He slipped both items into his bag without saying a word. That night, at home, he looked her up. Within minutes, he found the articles, the missing posters, and a photo that matched the ID in his hand. Her face was still young, frozen in time, wearing the same expression she had the night she vanished. He didn't sleep. Instead, he stared at the badge on his kitchen counter, wondering how it had survived untouched in a wing no one had entered in over a decade. And why, as he looked at it under the lamp, the radio beside it suddenly crackled to life with a burst of static that made his skin crawl. By the time Leo showed up at Michael's apartment 2 days later, he looked like he hadn't slept in either of them. He held out the badge and the radio without a word, hands trembling slightly as if part of him still didn't believe what he'd found. Michael stared at the objects on the table. The plastic cracked, the lettering faint with age but still readable, Lena Harrow. The badge photo matched the one in his wallet, the same photo he'd carried for over a decade, but it was the radio that made his stomach drop. It wasn't just static, Leo swore it had broadcast something. Not voices exactly, but tones. 3 long bursts, followed by silence, like someone trying to send a signal from deep underground. Michael didn't doubt him. There were too many coincidences already, too many forgotten corridors and malfunctioning locks. He thanked Leo, offered him coffee he didn't drink, and promised to keep in touch. After the door closed, Michael turned back to the radio and badge, placing them beside the pager. He could feel something beginning to surface, like sediment stirred in dark water. Lena had been trying to leave breadcrumbs. He drove out to St. Amelia just after dusk. The construction crews had finished for the day, and the parking lot was nearly empty. Michael had been back before, more times than he could count, but this time he walked past the main entrance and around to the rear service access. The fence surrounding the old west wing had been temporarily pulled down, and a section of wall near the east stairwell was partially stripped of its outer paneling. He stepped through the opening, flashlight in hand, heart pounding harder than he expected. The air inside was thick with mildew and something metallic. Old charts still hung on rusted hooks. There were gloves turned to dust, empty med carts, and shattered tiles underfoot. But what stopped him wasn't any of that. It was a message scrawled in faded red marker along one wall of the nurse's station, barely visible unless you caught it from the right angle. 6 words, Room B22. Do not let them in. Michael snapped a photo and backed out, his breath loud in the quiet. He didn't know what B22 had been used for, but he was certain of one thing. Lena had been there, and she had tried to warn someone. Maybe even him. Michael spent the next several days digging through old hospital blueprints and renovation plans, chasing any reference to Room B22. At first, it didn't make sense. The current layout showed no such room. On paper, the B level of the West Wing ended at Room B20, a small observation room near the former physical therapy unit. But a blueprint from 1979, water-damaged and nearly illegible in spots, showed something different. An unmarked chamber tucked between the staff break room and the service elevator. A hand-drawn note beside it simply read, Observation Alt B22. It had been erased from the modern layout, not relocated, not renamed, erased. With a copy of the older blueprint folded into his coat, Michael returned to the hospital under the cover of another overcast evening. The night security guard was asleep in his booth, and the remaining contractors were long gone. Michael slipped through the same broken paneling he had found days earlier, navigating the maze of collapsed ceiling tiles and exposed wiring until he reached what should have been a blank wall. Instead, there was a narrow utility door sealed with a single rusted bolt. It took nearly 10 minutes with a pry bar to loosen it. When it finally gave, the air that rushed out was colder than the rest of the wing, stale and heavy. He stepped inside and found himself in a small, windowless room. The walls were tiled halfway up, then transitioned to yellowed plaster. A rolling gurney sat pushed against the far side. Cabinets lined the wall, their contents covered in dust, gauze rolls, vials of outdated sedatives, torn surgical drapes. But what caught his eye was the chair. A medical restraint chair, bolted to the floor, with cracked leather cuffs still hanging from the arms. Beside it, a rolling cart held a notebook, its first few pages missing, the remaining ones filled with dates, times, and initials. The last page was marked October 17, 1990. There was no signature. Michael's chest tightened as he realized what this room had been. Not a patient room, not even a backup exam room. It was an off-record holding area, one that had been buried under bureaucracy and drywall. And Lena had made it here, maybe even been brought here. He stepped back toward the door, careful not to disturb anything. But before he could leave, a pager buzzed softly in his coat pocket, though he hadn't touched it. When he looked down, the screen flashed one word, B22. Michael didn't move for a long time. The quiet hum of the pager in his coat pocket faded into silence, but the weight of what it displayed remained. B22. It wasn't just a room number now, it was a message. A signal from something, or someone, that had been waiting to be found. He stepped slowly back into the center of the room, flashlight sweeping across the corners, pausing on the dark stains etched into the floor beneath the restraint chair. They were old, dried into the tile, but unmistakable. He knelt down and found a small brass plate embedded near the baseboard. The serial number matched a discontinued line of medical chairs used primarily for psychological observation. Most had been phased out by the late 70s. He turned to the cabinet. The drawer groaned as he pulled it open. Inside, beneath layers of dust, was a folder stamped in red with a faded hospital crest. No patient name, just a date, October 1990, and a set of initials that froze him in place, L.H. The folder contained a consent form, unsigned, and a checklist for neurological monitoring, complete with sedative doses logged across a 24-hour span. Some boxes had been ticked in pencil, others in black ink. The ink changed halfway down the page. Michael stood up, heart pounding, and flipped through the remaining contents. At the very back was a single Polaroid photo. It was dark, blurry, but it showed the corner of the room he was standing in now. The restraint chair was visible. In it sat a figure, head tilted, arms bound, hair pulled back the way Lena used to wear it during long shifts. Her face was turned just slightly away, but the curve of her jaw, the angle of her shoulder, was unmistakable. His stomach dropped. This wasn't a theory anymore. It wasn't a collection of fading leads and forgotten testimony. Lena had been brought here, confined, documented, and someone had made sure no one would ever know. The notebook, the consent form, the photograph, all of it had been buried behind locked doors and false construction walls, sealed away with the kind of precision that didn't come from carelessness. It came from intent. Michael turned off the flashlight. For a second, the room held him in absolute darkness. Then, once more, the pager buzzed against his chest. This time, the screen showed something new. A timestamp, 4:17 a.m. He hadn't noticed it before. It was 5 minutes after Lena had last been seen alive. Michael left the room slowly, every movement deliberate, like one wrong step might make the whole wing breathe again. The documents were zipped into his coat. The pager, still warm from the last buzz, remained in his pocket. He didn't look back at the chair. He couldn't. The hospital was silent as he retraced his steps through the maze of half-demolished corridors. Somewhere above him, a pipe let out a sharp hiss of pressure. It sounded too close, too alive. He picked up his pace. Back in his car, he sat with the engine off, letting the cold from the steering wheel settle into his hands. The Polaroid sat in the passenger seat, barely lit by the streetlight spilling through the windshield. Her face was turned away, but he knew. There was no doubt anymore. Whatever had happened to Lena had taken place in that room. It had been planned, or at least orchestrated under cover of policy, and buried beneath silence ever since. He drove straight to the apartment of a friend named Carla Ortiz, a retired nurse who had worked at St. Amelia in the late 80s and early 90s. She had been a floor lead back then and had always kept a distant but respectful connection with Michael after Lena's disappearance. When he showed her the documents, her face drained. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the consent form. "I remember this," she said quietly, tapping the initials. These forms weren't for patients, they were internal, used for off-book trials or temporary observation cases, things that didn't show up on the charts. She scanned the dosing logs. These weren't standard meds either. This cocktail was experimental. We weren't supposed to use this protocol unless there was a psych eval ordered by administration. Michael showed her the Polaroid next, and Carla's expression shifted from confusion to horror. She pointed to a faint shadow in the lower corner of the photo, just behind the doorframe. "That man. The coat. I think that's Dr. Harold Greaves." Michael stared at the name. It wasn't familiar, not yet, but the weight in Carla's voice made it stick. She looked at him, voice almost shaking, and said, "If Lena got in his way, she didn't just disappear. She was silenced." And in that moment, Michael knew the search was no longer about where Lena had gone. It was about who had made her vanish and why. The name Harold Greaves hadn't meant anything to Michael at first, but that changed quickly. Within a day, he'd uncovered enough to realize he wasn't chasing a shadow, he was chasing a man who had once held considerable sway inside St. Amelia. Greaves had been the head of internal research during the late 80s, a department folded quietly into administrative restructuring following a series of budget cuts and oversight investigations. No one had publicly connected the department to patient care, but the few mentions he found hinted at something more. Experimental trials, off-the-record transfers, medical waivers approved without patient or family signatures. Michael pulled what he could from archived hospital newsletters and old journal entries. Greaves was once praised for his work in rapid assessment diagnostics, a vague title that sounded impressive but said nothing. Then, in early 1991, just months after Lena vanished, Greaves resigned abruptly. No statement, no press. His license remained valid, but he never practiced again. He bought property in a rural part of the state and disappeared into private life. The coincidence was too clean. He brought the folder and photograph to a retired reporter named Ellis Bram, someone who had covered the hospital beat in the late 80s and had his own reasons for distrusting St. Amelia's upper ranks. Ellis was slow-moving now, cancer in remission, but his memory was razor-sharp. He took one look at the photo and leaned back, the breath gone from him. "I knew something was wrong the year they shut down the West Wing," he muttered. There were rumors Greaves was using that space for something else, something not cleared by the board, but no one could prove it. Michael asked him what kind of research would require sedatives and a locked room. Ellis didn't answer right away. He just opened a drawer and pulled out a thin file labeled Operation Silhouette. Inside were pages from a whistleblower complaint dated 1989, redacted and never published. The words that weren't blacked out told just enough: covert testing, unlisted participants, nurses reporting missing documentation, and in the margin of one page, handwritten in pencil, a single name circled twice: L. Harrow. Michael sat still, the folder in his lap, heart racing. Whatever Operation Silhouette had been, Lena had found it, and someone had made sure that discovery never left the hospital walls, until now. Michael didn't sleep that night. The folder from Ellis sat open across his dining table, its contents spread out like puzzle pieces, waiting for a picture to form. Operation Silhouette. It had the sound of something buried for a reason. The documents weren't complete, but the fragments painted a chilling outline. Patients flagged as non-compliant or non-verbal, individuals transferred in from other care facilities, some without families, others without names at all. Lena's name had been penciled in, not typed, as if she was never meant to be included in the record but had become part of it anyway. He imagined her filing a report, walking into that wing the night she vanished not by chance, but because she had seen something. Maybe she'd gone back to document it. Maybe she'd confronted someone. He replayed the timeline again and again. Her last chart entry was at 3:57 a.m. Her bag and keys were still in her locker. The cameras in the west corridor failed at 4:03. And at 4:12, her pager received the final, unexplained alert. The timestamp that haunted him now, glowing faintly in the dark. By morning, he had made up his mind. He called Carla again and asked about hospital sublevels. She was hesitant, but after a pause, she admitted something she'd never told the police. Back in 1990, there were whispers about an old basement floor beneath the West Wing that didn't appear on the updated blueprints. It had been decommissioned after the fire in '82 and supposedly filled in. But every once in a while, a low hum could be heard near the east stairwell, like machinery left running far below the surface. Michael returned to the hospital that afternoon, this time with a borrowed utility key and the faded 1979 blueprint tucked into his jacket. He traced the route from room B22 to the old elevator shaft, now sealed but not dismantled. The power was long gone, but the metal doors still bore scratches near the frame, as if someone had tried to pry them open once, long ago. He pressed his palm to the cold surface and stood in silence. Somewhere beneath his feet was the last place Lena might have been seen alive. And if the operation really had a basement level, that's where the truth was still hiding, waiting for someone to finally pull it back into the light. Michael returned late the next night, long after the contractors had packed up and the hospital slipped into its quiet rhythm of low voices and fluorescent hum. He entered through the west access corridor using the borrowed key, retracing his steps through the now familiar decay of the abandoned wing. The elevator shaft stood ahead like a monument to everything that had been hidden, its rusted doors sealed with industrial bolts. He set down his bag and retrieved the pry bar. It took longer than he expected. Each bolt resisted as if the building itself didn't want to let go of what it had buried. But one by one, the old locks gave. Behind the doors was not the expected darkness of an empty shaft, but something stranger, a narrow metal ladder descending into shadow, bolted against the wall of a concrete column. The air that rose from below was damp and still. Michael clicked on his flashlight and began to climb. The rungs groaned under his weight, and for a moment he thought they might snap, but they held. After 10 feet, the light caught something. A landing, concrete, stained. He stepped down into a narrow hallway with low ceilings and peeling paint. The space didn't match any blueprint. No signage, no room numbers. Just old steel doors spaced evenly along one side, each with a small reinforced window, all painted shut. The corridor ended at a thicker door, heavier than the rest. Its glass was cracked, and just beyond it, faint glimmers bounced from his light off rows of metal shelving. Inside, the room looked like a forgotten archive. Boxes, some collapsing with moisture, others stacked carefully and labeled in neat, clipped handwriting. Many bore no labels at all. Michael reached for the nearest intact box and opened it. Medical files, faded forms, handwritten notes, photographs. He thumbed through them and froze. Every file was stamped with the same project title, Silhouette. Most were dated between 1988 and 1990. Every subject listed was referred to by a number, not a name. But one had a scribbled note along the margin. Harrow, observed transfer. Logged under B22, then reassigned. Michael stood in the silence, surrounded by the paper trail of an operation no one had ever intended to survive inspection. This wasn't just where Lena had been taken, this was where they had tried to erase her. The further Michael dug into the files, the more surreal it became. The names were never used, only case numbers, most paired with vague behavioral notes and timestamps. Some documents referenced procedures that had no known equivalents in modern medicine, scribbled in shorthand like stimulus isolation protocol or duration suppressed assessment. One file mentioned a procedure carried out in the early morning hours of October 18, 1990. The entry was short, clinical, and unsigned. Beneath it, someone had drawn a horizontal line and written in block letters, "Transfer complete. No follow-up required." In the corner of the archive room, a rusted filing cabinet had broken open from years of swelling and moisture. Inside, Michael found something different: photographs. Not medical scans or test results, but Polaroids, the kind taken in haste. A hallway. A figure in a nurse's uniform, mid-stride. A gurney being wheeled through a dim corridor by 2 men in surgical masks, and in one image, blurred but unmistakable, Lena's ID badge swinging as she reached for something out of frame. Michael lowered the photo and took a long breath. It wasn't just that she had discovered something she shouldn't have. She had documented it, tried to stop it. She had gone into the West Wing that night, not because she was lured there, but because she had decided not to stay quiet, and someone had made sure she never left. He packed as much as he could carry into his bag, snapping pictures of what he couldn't take, knowing time was no longer on his side. The walls seemed to lean closer as he moved, the weight of what had been hidden pressing in around him. Just as he turned to go, his flashlight caught something at the far end of the room, a door partially open, its hinges warped and swollen. Behind it was a small alcove, barely more than a closet. And there, covered in dust and resting beneath a torn emergency blanket, was a shoe. A woman's shoe. White canvas, faded pink trim, the kind Lena wore with her scrubs. Michael dropped to one knee, reaching gently beneath the blanket. His fingers touched something hard and cold. A bone, human, small, and beside it, buried in a corner, was her hospital pager, still powered, still blinking, as if it had never stopped trying to call her back. Michael emerged from the basement with the weight of history pressing against his chest. The bag slung over his shoulder was filled with evidence, pieces of a puzzle long buried, pieces that should have never been lost. He didn't speak on the drive home, didn't turn on the radio. The silence was louder than anything, stretched tight with the knowledge of what he'd seen and what it confirmed. Lena hadn't simply vanished. She'd been taken, hidden, and left to disappear beneath layers of concrete and time. The pager he had found in that hidden alcove now sat on the passenger seat beside her shoe, still blinking faintly, its battery somehow clinging to life after 11 years. He hadn't dared power it off. It felt sacred now, like a heartbeat trapped in plastic, a final pulse reaching across time to say, "I was here, I didn't run." That night, he called a contact he had been holding in reserve, a detective named Harper, recently retired but still well connected. Michael didn't ask for permission or advice. He just laid out the story, the photo, the files, the hidden sublevel, the remains. Harper didn't interrupt. When it was over, there was a pause, and then a low, steady response. "Meet me in the morning. Don't talk to anyone else." Before sunrise, Michael made digital copies of every photo and document. He sent encrypted versions to Carla, to Ellis, and to a secure server only he could access, just in case. As the sun cracked over the horizon, gold light pouring across the quiet street outside his window, he looked down at the shoe on his kitchen table. He could still see the faint scuff on the toe, the one Lena had gotten when they were moving furniture during her last visit to their mother's house. She had laughed, said it gave the shoe's character. He hadn't cried until then. But now, the tears came quietly, not from shock, not from fear, but from the sudden, devastating certainty that she had fought until the very end. She hadn't just uncovered something forbidden, she had tried to stop it, and when they came for her, she left behind everything she could, hoping someone would follow the trail. And finally, someone had. The meeting with Harper took place in the back booth of a diner that hadn't changed its wallpaper since the 70s. He arrived with a thick notepad and the kind of face that made it clear he'd seen worse than what Michael was about to say, but maybe not by much. Michael laid everything out in careful order. The basement, the documents, the shoe, Lena's remains, the photograph, and finally, the pager, still blinking, still impossibly alive. Harper listened, his pen barely moving. When it was over, he leaned back in the booth and let out a long breath. "I'm going to need access to that sublevel," he said quietly, "and a judge who won't flinch." By noon, things moved faster than Michael expected. Harper still had friends, people who owed him favors, people who remembered Lena's case as more than just a line in a cold file. Within 48 hours, the police had sealed off the West Wing and a forensic team was on site. The hidden basement was photographed and cataloged. The room with the chair was reopened. And in the alcove, the remains were confirmed as human. Female. Preliminary dental records matched Lena. News of the discovery didn't break immediately. There were still protocols, chain of custody issues, internal reviews. But among the small circle who knew the truth, there was a sense of grim relief. She had finally been found, not intact, not saved, but real, no longer lost in theory or myth. Her story, for too long denied resolution, was beginning to surface in ways that couldn't be silenced. The files from Operation Silhouette were turned over to the district attorney's office. They revealed a pattern of medical experimentation, undocumented patient transfers, and a network of compliance that reached far beyond the hospital walls. Names were redacted, but not all of them. One stood out clearly. Dr. Harold Greaves. Subpoenas were issued. Old staff members were contacted. Some denied everything. Others broke down almost immediately. Michael watched it all unfold with a numb kind of clarity. He had followed Lena's voice through silence and static, and now the world was finally starting to listen. She had left behind a trail that no one thought would survive, but it had, and piece by piece, justice was beginning to catch up. The arrest came quietly. No press, no cameras, just a knock on a cabin door in a wooded stretch of county land where Harold Greaves had spent the last 10 years of his life pretending none of it had happened. He was older now, face gaunt, posture hunched with the weight of time and secrets poorly buried. When confronted with the evidence, photos, signatures, patient files, and Lena's name written in his own handwriting, he didn't speak, not at first. He sat down slowly, asked for a glass of water, and stared at the folder like it belonged to someone else. But eventually, the silence cracked. In a taped statement given later that night, Greaves admitted to overseeing Operation Silhouette during its final year. He spoke in the careful tone of someone still trying to protect others, but the facts came out. The program had been initiated as a behavioral trial on patients deemed unfit for standard care. When internal oversight began to tighten, the West Wing was repurposed without board approval. And when Lena Harrow began asking questions about patient logs, missing charts, the door at the end of the hall that no one was supposed to have a key to, she became, in his words, a complication. He claimed she had entered the wing of her own will, following a trail she wasn't meant to find. He said she confronted a technician during a transfer and had to be contained. He didn't admit to her death outright, but the implication hung in the air like a second confession. She had seen too much. She had tried to report it, and the system around her had collapsed inward in silence. Michael sat in on the hearing a week later. The courtroom was nearly empty, just a scattering of reporters and former staff. He watched Greaves sit in a wrinkled suit, eyes hollow but dry, and felt no satisfaction. Lena's name was said aloud by someone other than him for the first time in years. It rang out clearly, printed on the official record, no longer a whisper in a hallway. Outside the courthouse, a light drizzle fell. Michael walked alone to the parking lot with the folder clutched under his arm and Lena's pager in his coat pocket, now silent at last. The ceremony was small. No podium, no speeches, just a handful of people standing beneath a gray morning sky in the courtyard beside St. Amelia's Chapel. A brass plaque had been mounted to the stone wall, just below the stained glass window Lena used to pass every night after shift. It read simply, "In memory of Nurse Lena Harrow, 1962-1990. She gave her voice to the silenced. Flowers had already begun to gather beneath it, some from former co-workers, some from people who'd never met her but had read her story and felt the weight of its truth. Michael stood off to the side, hands in his coat pockets, the pager still tucked away, no longer blinking but heavier than ever. He had thought about burying it with her, now that her remains would be laid to rest properly in a family plot beside their mother, but something told him not to. It had done what it was meant to do. It had lasted just long enough to be heard. Now it belonged to the record, to the story she had left behind like breadcrumbs through a dark and locked corridor. Inside the chapel, candles flickered against the stained glass, casting soft colors across the pews. Carla sat in the back row, holding a folded program in her lap. Ellis was there too, older than ever, but proud. Others came quietly and left just as quietly. A nurse from the night shift placed a single white rose at the altar. No one needed to speak. Lena had spoken enough in the pages she left behind, in the codes she logged, in the silent cry of a pager that shouldn't have been able to call out but did. The hospital began restructuring in the months that followed. An independent audit forced policy changes, oversight reforms, and a public apology from the board. Operation Silhouette was officially acknowledged in a press release no one wanted to read but couldn't ignore. It was too late to change what had happened, but not too late to make sure it couldn't happen again. As Michael walked back to his car, the clouds began to part, just faintly, enough to let a sliver of sunlight fall across the plaque. He paused and looked back, whispering her name to the wind. And for the first time in 11 years, he didn't feel like she was lost. He felt like she had finally been found.